Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Priyadarshini, Assistant Professor of Nephrology at Usmania General Hospital, Hyderabad, and a member of social media team of Indian Society of Nephrology Southern Chapter Conference, which is scheduled to happen in the city of Hyderabad, organized by Hyderabad Nephrology Forum from 8th to 11th of February 2024. This video is a part of series of pre-conference interviews with our esteemed international faculty. Today, I'm pleased to have Dr. Prabhakar Sharma amidst us. Welcome, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Sharma is a professor of internal medicine and head of the department of nephrology at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center at Texas, United States of America. His areas of interest include diabetic mellitus, diabetic kidney disease, metabolic syndrome, animal models of human disease, and dyslipidemia. He has many publications in international journals to his credit. Dr. Sharma, this comes as a part of pre-conference interviews for the upcoming ISN SE Southern Chapter 2024 conference. So before we proceed to your talk, about your talk, can you tell us about your other interests of nephrology?
Sure. Very pleased to be with you on this Zoom call and video session. I started with an interest in diabetes primarily because diabetes is the most common. It's a common medical disease, and it's the most common cause of kidney disease. And in the United States, particularly, anywhere from 40 to 60% of patients on dialysis have diabetes. And of course, hypertension goes along with it. But independent of diabetes, hypertension is also an important cause for kidney failure. So I've been interested, my clinical interests have been predominantly diabetes and hypertension. But also, I have focused a lot on pathogenesis. Unlike most of the my colleagues, I focused mostly on pathogenesis because it is the pathogenesis that helps us to find new directions in treatment. So I have been working on animal models and in the lab experiments, in vitro and in vivo studies to find out pathogenic mechanisms of disease. That's the other interest I have. And another area that I have focused in my career was the relationship between nitric oxide and kidney. So those are some main areas I've been involved in my clinical and research endeavors.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. That's interesting to know about nitric oxide and kidney disease. Can you a little bit elaborate about your current experimental research in your lab?
Sure. Before I get into the current experiments, I want to tell a little bit more about nitric oxide because it's a very it's a wonder molecule. When I started my career about 30 years ago in the United States, nitric oxide was little known, particularly the role of nitric oxide and kidney in kidney physiology or disease was basically unknown. So that's when I started my interests and started investigating. And after about a decade, I accumulated significant amount of data, particularly in the basic science area, that led me to write. I was invited to write a book on nitric oxide and kidney. And so that really took a lot of my efforts to understand and delineate the role of nitric oxide. But as you know, now nitric oxide is known to play a role in a variety of clinical disorders, including hepatorenal syndrome and various nephropathies. But when I was doing these studies, I got interested in animal models, and that's because, see, when you do experimental studies in the laboratory, you can come up with a hypothesis and test that hypothesis in cell culture models or in vitro studies. But ultimately, you want something that relates to human health and disease. So in order to accomplish that, one has to have a whole animal model. And so I spent a lot of time, since my interest was diabetic nephropathy. So the initial experiments were on nitric oxide and diabetes and diabetic nephropathy. But later on, I spent a lot of time trying to develop animal models for diabetic nephropathy. So at that point, I realized that there is no suitable model. All the existing models were not really close to human disease. In other words, as a correct animal model should basically duplicate or replicate human disease. And there was no such model for diabetic nephropathy. So we developed and we actually characterized an animal model for diabetic nephropathy, which is called ZSF rat model. But when we developed that, we have been working on that model for last 15 years. And so currently what we are doing is using that model. We have been looking at various aspects of pathogenesis and also trying some new potential drugs, and also looking at various aspects of metabolic syndrome. So interestingly, the animal model that we have developed exemplifies the entire metabolic syndrome, not just diabetes and diabetic kidney disease. So, because of that, we have accumulated a lot of information about metabolic syndrome and not only pathogenesis and some of the potential novel therapeutic approaches. As relating to the new studies that we are doing in the lab, we've been focusing for the last few years on biomarkers because, as you know, diabetic nephropathy is typically diagnosed so far or till recently with proteinuria as the hallmark. But we now know that it's not necessarily the case, and so we need newer and better biomarkers. So we've been looking at some novel biomarkers for kidney involvement in diabetes. In addition, there is one interesting aspect that has come to the limelight in research in general, and that is the impact of gender. In other words, the same disease may manifest in a different fashion in females versus males, and that's not well appreciated. More importantly, the same drug may not act similarly in both genders. So, and there has been an emphasis from the National Institute of Health to focus on both genders, in terms of both basic and clinical research. So we've been looking at gender differences in phenotypic expression of diseases. So that's one other thing. A couple of other things that we are looking at is cell-to-cell interactions in kidney. For example, the various, kidney has more than 24 types of cells. And so, but the important ones like the podocytes, the mesangial cells, the epithelial cells, the tubular epithelial cells, endothelial cells. So we are looking at some interactions between these two, how they talk to each other and how they communicate, and how the entire process of disease initiation to ultimate organ sclerosis takes place. This is an interesting area that we got into using co-cultures. We are trying to understand how the cells communicate with each other. Particularly, we are interested in EMT, which is epithelial mesenchymal transformation or transition. And so that's another area. And last but not least, we are also working on some interesting concepts, how the angiotensin and endothelin signaling pathways interact. This is because, as you know, in not only diabetic nephropathy, but also in other areas, endothelial blockade supplements the advantages of angiotensin blockade. And so what is that interaction between these two pathways is what we are investigating. And this is an example of reverse translational research, taking research from bedside to bench rather than bench to bedside. So these are some of the things that we are doing in our lab. And I have postdoctoral fellows and research graduate students and medical students and renal fellows that work in the lab. So it's a very active ongoing lab for at least 25 years now. So it's a exciting part of my career. My work, words, I enjoy doing research, and so it's an ongoing. And fortunately, I have funding for all these studies.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. That's a lot of interesting research in your lab, and we are glad, and it's really inspiring to see a lot of research going on in the most common metabolic syndrome contributing to the kidney disease worldwide. So, Dr. Sharma, I also hear you talk about dyslipidemia a lot in the many of the conferences. So, what interests you about dyslipidemia management and things related to dyslipidemia?
You're talking about electrolyte,
Yes.
diselectrolyte. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, it's one of these. So, for example, you take sodium disorders. Hyponatremia is the most common electrolyte disorders. When we make rounds in our hospitals, that's one of the common things we get consulted for. But yet, this at the same time, it's one of the most complex problems. It doesn't seem it's not as simple as it seems. So every day you learn new things about these electrolyte disorders, and so I think I enjoy teaching and learning about electrolyte disorders, and also one of the fascinating things is that I worked during my training in the United States. I worked with really good experts in electrolytes, so they have inspired me. And I want to just mention one mentor that actually shaped my career, and that is Dr. Donald Seldin, who actually started the field of nephrology in the United States. And I'm fortunate to be his student. And he died a few years ago at the age of 97, and he was working full time till his death. So he was a mentor and a inspiration for me. And he was he focused a lot on electrolyte and acid-base disorders. And many of my mentors were involved in that. And that's the reason why I take a lot of interest in these disorders. And we as nephrologists deal with these on a day-to-day basis. So the more we learn, the more we teach, the more these disorders get addressed properly in the patient care.
And yeah, agreed. Dyslipidemia management forms the heart of nephrology. So finally, I have one question for you, Dr. Sharma. You have an interesting session coming up at ISNSC 2024. So can you give us a glimpse of your talk?
Sure, sure. I've been also interested in the interaction between organs, and I mentioned the heart and kidney. I spent a few years on understanding the cardio-renal connections, and even I began talks on cardio-renal crosstalk. My interest was not just the clinical connection, because we know all the cardio-renal syndromes. We studied them. We also published some about this, various cardio-renal disorders. But more importantly, how do these organs talk to each other? What are the connecting pathways or signal? That is my interest. But over and beyond that, we have been aware of something called metabolic syndrome, as you mentioned, for a few decades now. But the fact that all these factors act together, like the cardio renal, the kidney, the cardiovascular system, and the metabolic factors act together and contribute to cardiovascular risk. And that is a concept that is getting strengthened day by day. And putting all the information that we have together, the American Heart Association has recently, just a few months ago, come up with a new term called cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome, CKM syndrome. We will be hearing a lot more about this. So basically, it's just signifies the pathophysiological interactions between various organ systems in this group that result in heightened or amplified cardiovascular risk. And this is what we see on a day-to-day basis. But this whole thing has been further strengthened by the fact that when you treat one aspect, it impacts on the other. For example, the recent trials have shown that drugs that were developed primarily to address, for example, metabolic issues such as hyperglycemia, diabetes. When you treat diabetes, SGLT2 blockers is an example. SGLT2 blockers were developed to address diabetes, but then later on, we found that they slow down the progression of kidney disease. At the same time, the data suggested they also decrease the cardiovascular risk. Same thing has been shown with GLP-1 agonists now. Even the mineralocorticoid antagonists also have similar effects. So, but going back to even metformin, decreases the vascular complications in diabetes. So this basically brings us back to a unifying concept that all these factors act together. How do they do? And we still have a lot of gaps in our understanding of this cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome. And so one other reason why I am interested in this area is because of the animal model we have. And just briefly, the ZSF rat that we have is actually a crossbreed between Zucker diabetic fat rat and spontaneously hypertensive heart failure rat. And this resultant rat model exhibits all the features of metabolic syndrome, such as obesity, hypertriglyceridemia, hyperglycemia, and hypertension, even kidney disease, heart failure. So this is what we see in our clinical disease. So I was very excited when I characterize this animal model. We use this to study many things. For example, when I was trying to understand the connection between the heart and the kidney, I looked at I took out the kidneys from these rats when they aged and died, or close to their death, and I took out the hearts and the kidneys and various organs. But when I took the homogenates of these organs and looked at next-gen sequencing to look at the pathways that are affected, there's so much overlap between cardiac and renal pathways in disease. So basically, it shows that these operate. Also, look at the drugs that I mentioned, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, mineralocorticoid antagonists, SGLT2 blockers, GLP-1 agonists, all of them help both heart and the kidney. So it just helps us to understand why these things are so interdependent. So that's why I chose this topic, because firstly, the term cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome is a relatively new one, but it is spreading. Now you can find a synopsis of this entire description published by the American Heart Association just a few months ago. So I want to just kind of share this message and also discuss various aspects of this syndrome. Particularly, they have come up with a staging process and how to address different stages in the clinical management. And the main reason is this is one of the most common syndromes we deal with in our practices. So I think, I want to, as much as possible, cover various areas, particularly the new ideas, new concepts, new findings from clinical trials. So that's what I want to do in this talk.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. As you rightly put up, we do see a lot of cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome cases day in and out.
Right.
And thank you so much for sparing your valuable time with us. And it's my privileged opportunity to interact with you as a part of this pre-conference interview. And
Likewise.
I urge all the delegates not to miss out this exciting session about cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome, aka cardiorenal syndrome at ISN SE Con 2024. See you all there. Thank you.